Thank you very much, Collie. After an introduction like that, I had better make sense here. And thank you all very much, friends and colleagues. Good morning. Let me begin by thanking Dr. Ebrahim Assal, CEO of Trust Africa, Mr. Bekinkosi Moyo, CEO of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, and the chair of this 6th APC organizing committee, and our host, Professor Ali Auni from the American University in Cairo, and all of those who have made this conference worthwhile for every one of us, and for the very many years that this conference has gone on and has been very successful. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate in this 6th Africa Philanthropy Conference and to make these remarks on the theme of the conference, which is sustainable financing for development in the majority world. The question before us is both simple and profound. Can we redesign the financial future in a way that serves not a privileged few, but the vast majority of humanity? For the majority world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, this is not a question of convenience. It is a matter of survival, it's a matter of sovereignty and justice. But let me frame the context again, as I'm sure this has been done frequently in the past few days. Across Africa and much of the majority world, we face a perfect storm of challenges. A population that is youthful and fast-growing, demanding jobs, opportunity, and dignity. And there is a climate crisis that we are the least responsible for, but which is displacing communities, destroying crops, shrinking GDPs, and driving people from their homes. Africa is the fastest warming continent and the least prepared for the devastation of extreme climate events. Debt burdens, as I'm sure you've heard repeatedly in the last few days, are nearing 70% of GDP, with debt service now eclipsing national spending on health and education. And we have public revenue systems that are often outdated, narrow, and overwhelmed by informality and opacity and the extractive global practices. And just as these pressures intensify, so too has the retreat of traditional development assistance. The United States, of course, has withdrawn from or defunded key multilateral institutions, UNESCO, WHO, and now the dismantling of US aid. The UK has slashed development aid to Africa by as much as 40%. And many EU countries are cutting back in various proportions as well. But this is more than a shift in balance sheets. It's a signal that we must finance our futures, not on the basis of goodwill or benevolence, but through rethinking value, through strategy and power, not through dependency, but through redesign. And so allow me to share a few pillars on which the redesign of our financial future, the financial future of the majority world may rest. And I'm sure that you would have several other ideas also. The first pillar is perhaps the most overlooked. And this is the revaluation of what we already possess, reclaiming natural capital as an asset. Across Africa and the majority world, our most valuable assets, our forests, our peatlands, our rivers, our biodiversity, and mineral reserves do not appear on national balance sheets. GDP, as is traditionally calculated, completely ignores them. And so we have become paradoxes, rich in resources, but poor in creditworthiness. And this is where natural capital accounting becomes essential. Natural capital accounting is not just about environmental protection. It's a radical act of financial justice. It says our forests are not just forests, they are carbon sinks. Our mangroves are not just habitats, they are actually storm buffers. Our peatlands are not just terrain, they are climate stabilizers. They add real value, measurable in financial terms, to the preservation and propagation of global wealth. Yet they're not accounted for, let alone paid for. When properly accounted for, these become bankable assets. They enable access to new financing, all sorts of new financing instruments, green bonds, conservation bonds, debt for nature swaps, whose markets are growing exponentially. But without data, without valuation and verification, we're locked out. Some countries are moving ahead. Botswana, for example, has developed detailed water and mineral accounts that now guide sustainable pricing and extraction. South Africa also uses national biodiversity accounts in its development planning and has attracted private investments for conservation finance. Liberia and Uganda are also piloting wetland and forest valuations with support from WAVES and UN partners. This is not a luxury, it's a necessity, because without natural capital accounting, our natural wealth remains invisible. But with it, we can actually unlock sustainable financing, not by extracting nature, but by valuing and preserving it. The second pillar is how to pay for reversing energy poverty. How do we pay for reversing energy poverty? Africa has the world's largest untapped renewable energy potential, both in absolute and relative terms. Africa's renewable potential is 50x the global anticipated electricity demand in 2040. So we have much more than is required, even for the entire world. Despite this abundance, of course, you're very familiar with the figures. Over 600 million people lack access to electricity in Africa. Nearly 1 billion lack access to clean cooking facilities. And where it is available, electricity prices in many African countries are far too high and are often at par, sometimes above various upper middle income countries. So there is a massive problem of energy poverty, which means development and personal well-being are jeopardized. The reaction of many majority world governments and their development partners to this problem is to strongly focus on creating energy access as a first priority. And because grid coverage and interconnectivity are low, and the biggest energy access challenges are in peri-urban and usually rural areas, off-grid and mini-grid solutions tend to take priority. Sadly, these often are just not financially sustainable. And so they need consistent donor or public financing, which in itself is a threat to continued access and tends to limit available capacity, especially capacity that's sufficient to meet even the very basic needs. And it's certainly insufficient for catalytic entrepreneurial activities such as on-site agro-processing or cooling. So the opportunity to set in motion a truly virtuous cycle in which energy access drives economic growth and livelihood improvement is lost. At first glance, the fact of a lack of energy access to large rural populations in a situation of abundant renewable energy potential may be confusing. I mean, one may wonder, how can you have so much renewable energy and yet, still have the kinds of problems of access such as we have? Yet, it's important to realize that globally, universal energy access tends to be achieved through cross-subsidies. And that's really the reality. Nobody gets global access without cross-subsidies of one kind or the other, whether you're rich or poor. Now, these work out differently in different settings. But one approach is to use the profits from serving the urban and industrial customers to fund grid expansion or to cover marginal costs of grid solutions in order to have enough to serve more remote customers. Energy-poor customers in many African countries represent a real need for energy, but not a bankable demand. So they are both insufficiently aggregated and often will not be able to afford the fully loaded costs of their energy. So given the high capex for investments in energy generation and the economies of scale in many projects, investors in these projects need to see secure offtake. They simply need to see how offtake will be funded. Where are we going to get our money from? The most predictable and most financially viable approach to this is to secure anchor industrial demand from newly established energy-hungry industrial activity. In other words, find industries that use a lot of energy and use the excess capacity for rural customers, who would, of course, not have been able to pay the fully loaded cost of power. And there are opportunities everywhere. The world needs to green everything. Everything that it consumes, the world needs to green everything that it consumes and remove carbon at a very large scale. So energy-hungry industries are looking for large-scale renewable energy access. Ideally, such energy-hungry industries want to be close to relevant primary materials and markets and other relevant production factors. For example, they want to be close to where they can find labor and land. In fact, it is exactly those energy-intense processes that will make investments in renewable energy bankable, which in turn can drive increased energy access, either through larger scale generation on the backbone of industrial demand or through cross-subsidizing dedicated off-grid and mini-grid solutions. Also, location decisions when developing green industrialization need to take into account that we are moving from a world where energy in the form of hydrocarbon was easy and cheap to transport to one where renewable energy is simply not easy to transport renewable energy. So it calls for locating energy-hungry industries and their processes close to the actual sources of renewable energy to produce low embedded emission products for global consumption. And that's by linking renewable energy supply directly to large-scale energy-hungry industries. Now, those energy-hungry industries, of course, can then serve as anchors. But let me be specific. There are three categories of industries that offer particular promise. The first are industries where production can be located anywhere, and energy cost is the deciding factor. So, for example, green data centers, for instance, don't need to be located in New York or Frankfurt. They can be located wherever renewable energy power is abundant and cheap. Microsoft, for example, has a planned 1 gigawatt geothermal-powered data center in Kenya. And that's, a good case in point. Or even the prospects of direct air capture technology, removing CO2 from the atmosphere. These systems work best in regions with cheap, clean power. Africa can lead here, and we don't need to follow. The second are industries where location is strategic. Africa's maritime and aviation geography makes it ideal for producing green fuels, ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, for global shipping and aviation routes. Likewise, producing green fertilizer domestically aligns with all of Africa's food security goals while reducing import bills and boosting employment. The third is industries where we already have the minerals. Africa holds over 40% of global cobalt reserves, 30% of bauxite, and vast deposits of lithium, iron ore, and copper. Yet we export raw materials and import the value-added products at a premium. Why? Because we lack the energy infrastructure and financing models to process locally. But if we power smelters, refineries, and manufacturing facilities with renewable energy, then we cut emissions, we keep value on the continent, and we can actually position ourselves as exporters of green solutions, not just raw inputs. This is how we move, in my view, from climate victimhood to climate leadership. But anchor demand is not a silver bullet. We must also fix enabling conditions. We must fix regulations, skills development, logistics, and of course the cost of capital. We need de-risking tools. We need guarantees, blended finance, and long-term purchase agreements to catalyze investments at scale. We must also fight for fair market access, and that fair market access is so crucial. For example, the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanisms, CBAM, if poorly implemented, risk penalizing African exports, even if our exports are greener than European ones. The problem with the CBAM is that it does not penalize the use of carbon-intensive energy sources for production, which is 70% of the carbon content. So, for example, if you as an industry use coal fire, which of course, as you know, is carbon-intensive, to convert bauxite to aluminum, you are not penalized. So this disincentivizes green production options. And Africa's comparative advantage also is disincentivized because we can be the first truly green industrial civilization. We can actually manufacture green and cheaper than anywhere else in the world. The third pillar is global, and it speaks to equity and voice. It's the necessity for reforming the global financial architecture. And it may sound almost utopian, but it is absolutely necessary. The financial system that we operate today was not built for or with the participation of the majority world. That system is the one that now governs everything, from development lending to climate finance. But it does so without adequately representing the 6 billion people living outside the G7. And let's take a look. Africa, with over 1.5 billion people, holds just 7% of voting power in the IMF. Cost of capital in Africa is high. African governments pay 5 times as much interest in the bond market as they would if multilateral development banks were adequately capitalized. Those seeking investments for private projects face high costs of capital and unhealthily short tenors driven by both real and perceived risk factors. The allocation of special drawing rights in 2021, for example, sent 5% to Africa and over 40% to the wealthiest countries. This was the post-COVID situation. Thirdly, climate finance also remains unmet. And when funds do flow, they often come as loans, not grants, and in ways that bypass national systems. Many of these issues have been identified in the Bridgetown Initiative and the Capital Adequacy Framework, amongst others. And suggestions for reform have been made repeatedly. They include a wide range of tools that increase and strengthen the balance sheets of multilateral development banks, and also ensure that more of their deployment actually goes to emerging and frontier economies and drive more deployment towards climate-aligned investments. Technical solutions have also been made, such as recycling of SDRs, smart capital blending, and tailored risk mitigation. All of this, these suggestions have been made repeatedly, but things have to change. We need fair representation and a voice in global financial institutions that are reflective of today's population and development needs. We need reforms to credit rating agencies to eliminate bias and reward real governance progress. And I'm sure we're familiar with some of the initiatives on the African credit rating agencies. Of course, it would have its own complications and problems. But at least it's a direct challenge to the situation that we find ourselves in, where rating agencies simply taking the perceived risks. Most of the perceived risks, of course, as you know, are exaggerated. A new global climate finance mechanism that includes rechanneling of SDRs, scaling loss and damage finance, and expanding concessional funding is also required. Global tax justice through a UN-led tax convention that ends illicit profit shifting and strengthens national treasuries is something that that has been called for repeatedly. And we say UN-led for fairness and balance. The current architecture, the current global financial architecture, privileges the powerful and fragments the rest and constrains the future. We need a system that invests in global public goods, that pools resources predictably and centers development where it matters most. The fourth pillar follows from the third. It is resolving Africa's disastrous debt burden. Africa is experiencing its worst debt crisis in 80 years. Today, more than 20 low-income African countries are either bankrupt or at high risk of debt distress. The continent's debt to GDP ratio is 64%, and that's on average. And much of its revenue is consumed by repayments. So with limited fiscal space, Africa cannot invest meaningfully in development. Making matters worse, Africa remains overly dependent on commodity exports, yet its debt is outpacing export earnings. According to the UN, Africa is the only region where debt is growing faster than GDP. And despite growth efforts, African countries are still forced to borrow at higher interest rates than anywhere else in the world due to inflated risk perceptions perpetuated by rating agencies. As a result, Africa pays the highest borrowing costs globally. Over the past 15 years, Africa's interest payments have more than doubled, the steepest increase in the world. And as we know, the net capital flows from public and private creditors, excluding multilateral creditors, to developing countries were negative in 2022 to 2023. It took a deep dive in 2022, and of course, it became worse in 2023. So we paid more to the creditors than we received in new inflows from debt issuance or from new loans. And going to the private capital markets is also not an option for the majority of emerging markets and developing economies, as borrowing, of course, is completely out of reach for them, with bond yields surpassing expected growth rates. Nigeria and Ethiopia, of course, for instance, have bond yields over 15%. Kenya has bond yields over 10%. So many African countries and others are burdened with debt so heavy that on average, governments now spend more servicing debt than on health or education or any of the real human capital development needs. The consequences are devastating. Over 150 million Africans were pushed into poverty between 2019 and 2021. And of course, we're familiar with some of the actual figures. And a lot of this was due to health expenses alone. Africa loses over 2.4 trillion annually in productivity due to illness. Yet health budgets are being cut to service debt. In Nigeria, for instance, over 70% of national health spending comes directly from individuals' pockets. Meanwhile, around half of government revenue goes to debt servicing. This is the reality across many African countries, trapped in a cycle that perpetuates poverty and stifles development. With Africa's population expected to rise from 1.5 billion to 2.5 billion by 2050, the urgency cannot be overstated. The current debt relief solutions are hardly fit for purpose. The Common Debt Framework, for example, adopts a case-by-case model, and this has simply not worked efficiently. Negotiations have proved to be too lengthy and cumbersome, and there are few incentives for private creditors to participate and ultimately deliver very little actual relief. But happily, there are many new ideas and initiatives around workable solutions. In February 2025, former African heads of state and leaders launched the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative. And this is one of those initiatives that I think need to be considered. In Cape Town, the ALDRI, the short form for the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative, called for an urgent and coordinated action and proposed a two-pronged approach to debt relief. The first is comprehensive debt restructuring for highly indebted countries based on a predictable, fair, and inclusive process involving all creditors with comparability of treatment where participation is based on the external debt sustainability analysis by the IMF, the DSA of the IMF and World Bank. The second prong is reducing the cost of capital through credit enhancements from multilateral institutions and debt suspension mechanisms to create some fiscal space for climate and development investments. Now, as part of a more standardized process, that initiative also believes that we should also think of some sort of debt moratorium or debt standstill that applies once a country enters into debt restructuring process. There ought to be a moratorium. There ought to be a standstill. Now, this would provide an incentive to speed up the process. When you have a debt moratorium, when you have a debt standstill, everybody is interested, especially creditors, are interested in speeding up the process. At the moment, the common debt framework does not allow a situation of a debt standstill or moratorium while negotiations are going on. So negotiations can go on forever. And this is especially so from the private sector side. We also think that it might be important to include MDBs in debt relief discussions. Now, this is a controversial point because the crucial issue of safeguarding their AAA ratings is one that obviously we must give attention to. Most MDBs simply don't want to get into debt relief discussions because it may mean losing their AAA ratings. But the empirical reality is that large parts of the external debt of IDA-eligible countries is owed to multilateral creditors. So these are big creditors, and you really can't exclude them from debt relief negotiations if you want to achieve anything. And this would mean that large parts of debt remain unaddressed, reducing the level of resources that could be freed up through debt relief. As the last international debt report by the World Bank has shown, multilateral lenders are increasingly lenders of last resort. And multilateral lenders bail out private creditors with their low-interest loans. Now, this is not what these funds were meant for. So it might be necessary to make sure that private creditors participate in the debt restructuring process and that they also take haircuts. The fifth pillar is domestic resource mobilization, the ability to raise, to manage, and retain our own revenues equitably and transparently. I'll just highlight very quickly Nigeria's recent progress in debt relief mobilization in DRMs. In July 2025, Nigeria passed landmark tax reform legislation, consolidating over a dozen fragmented laws into a single modern tax act. So expanding the tax base to include digital assets, FX gains, these are gains made from differentials in foreign exchange markets between the official market and parallel markets, and platform transactions. The law also introduces a minimum effective tax rate for multinationals to ensure that they contribute fairly. So there's also streamlining compliance through e-invoicing and VAT digitization, creating a development levy also to simplify sectoral taxation and improve predictability. And this, I think, is bold, necessary, and commendable. But Nigeria is not alone. Rwanda now finances over 58% of its national budget from domestic resources through tourism, levies, excise duties, and targeted VAT. Across the continent, the African Tax Administration Forum is also doubling exchange of information requests and enforcing mutual transparency standards. So regional simulations also by the AFDB and OECD are helping countries identify untapped sources of revenue and fairer policy tools. So modern tax policy is not just about extracting more. It's about, first of all, widening the base, and it's about extracting fairly. It's about taxing wealth, not just wages. And of course, taxing digitally, transparently, and justly. And finally, we come to perhaps the most galling issue of all, illicit financial flows. Curbing illicit financial flows. Africa loses between 50 billion to 88 billion every year to illicit flows. And of course, this is far more than it receives, even in ODAs. Funds hidden in offshore accounts, profits shifted to low-tax jurisdictions, trade misinvoicing, shell companies, anonymous trusts. The loss is not just fiscal, it's moral. We must enforce public beneficial ownership registries, join global information sharing frameworks, like the OECD's exchange of tax data, regulate transfer pricing and implement real-time commodity benchmarks, recover stolen assets, and mandate their use for development. And I must say that recovering stolen assets is not as easy as it sounds. One would have thought that it should be easy enough where you discover stolen assets from your country in another country, and you just want to reclaim it. And there are all sorts of regulations and laws and obstacles to recovering stolen assets. So sometimes it could actually take years to recover those assets. So a lot of the countries that claim to want transparency, and a lot of institutions that claim to want transparency, are actually very unwilling to release stolen assets, because obviously stolen assets benefit those financial institutions in those various countries. So we need a much more transparent approach to recovery of assets. We need speed with respect to recovery of assets so that the receiver of stolen funds is not a beneficiary of those funds. I mean, you can't penalize receivers of stolen funds where they are sovereign nations. But surely they must be able to part with those stolen funds as quickly as possible. So there's a push for a UN-led financial governance framework, not one that's dominated by a handful of powerful economies. Until we fix retention, every reform risks becoming a revolving door. Money comes in, and just as quickly, it flows out. The sixth and last pillar is still on the subject of domestic resource mobilization. It's the role of African philanthropy. As overseas development assistance, and we've heard this repeatedly, and foreign philanthropies support Africa, it is evident now that that support is disappearing. There's obviously a decline. So African philanthropy must increasingly position itself to fill critical financing gaps. And then the challenges, of course, remain. Although we must admit that the influence of African philanthropies has grown with the rise of high net worth individuals, corporate foundations, and community-based giving. Examples include the Tony Elumelu Foundation, Dangote Foundation, Mo Ibrahim Foundation, the Gresham Marshall Trust, and the iGimokwede Foundation. These institutions have made notable contributions to entrepreneurship, to health, to education and governance. But despite their rising visibility, most African philanthropies operate on a relatively limited scale, especially when measured against the continent's vast development needs. Many remain elite-driven and focused on charitable or CSR-related initiatives, with fewer investing in long-term systems or in tackling root causes of inequality. Still, African philanthropies possess unique advantages. They are locally embedded, they are culturally informed, and less constrained by bureaucracy. These attributes enable them to play a more catalytic role in sustainable financing, particularly by providing risk-tolerant capital to attract larger investments into sectors like renewable energy and health and education, and then funding pilot projects that demonstrate the viability of local solutions, which governments and investors can then scale. They also can convene stakeholder engagements, governments, investors, civil society, for joint problem solving and ecosystem building. We were very fortunate at the UN-led Africa Innovation Fund. Very recently, we had a convening which was sponsored by the Igumokwe Foundation. We're trying to look at how to resource innovation systems all over Africa. And they, paid for that convening and also brought in the relevant experts. So those kinds of convenings, of course, are important and useful because that is the way to build institutional capacity, not just in public finance, but also systems that enable citizens' engagement and enable the best ideas to come forth to truly step into the expanded role. I think African philanthropies must also overcome internal limitations, including weak transparency, limited collaboration, and insufficient focus on systemic impact. With shrinking aid and donor fatigue, African philanthropies must evolve from gap fillers to system builders. Though their financial firepower may be much less than the global donors or multilaterals, their local legitimacy and strategic flexibility and convening power can unlock new pathways to sustainable finance and drive Africa-led development at scale. So let me conclude by saying that the majority world is not poor. It is underfinanced, it's underrepresented, and underestimated. But this century belongs to us. If we choose to claim it, let us redesign how we value our assets, how we structure our industries, how we participate globally, and how we mobilize resources domestically, and how we close the back doors of financial theft. Because sustainable finance is not a question of charity, it's a question of justice. It's a question of strategy and a question of courage. Let us fight smartly for a new global financial architecture. And let's finance our own future, not by default, but by design. Thank you very much.